Well, thanks for that kind welcome. I'm going to start the discussion kind of circling around Edward Snowden, but then kind of getting in ever broadening concentric circles into broader issues. I would like our conversation to be as fact-based as possible, so my role here is going to be to tell the truth as I know and believe it to be. I realize there could be ranges of views on a variety of issues, which is fine, but I'm going to give you how it looks to me. And by brief introduction, I've kind of worked on the inside for a fair number of years. There is no doubt that what Mr. Snowden has done has accelerated what was always a necessary and frankly inevitable discussion among free peoples about what it is you want your security services to do for you and what it is you will allow them to do for you. No question about it. I am also of the view that the way he went about this, however, has misshapen the debate. And so I want to begin by just kind of grabbing, I think I got about a half a dozen stories here that you've read, either in The Guardian or in some American papers like the New York Times or the Washington Post, maybe Der Spiegel, and kind of give you my view as to what I think was going on, which is not always totally consistent with the description of what was going on, all right? Which is a far cry from me condemning the article, even criticizing the article. It's just, let me tell you how there's some more stuff here you need to understand before you go forward. Let me start with Edward Snowden. This is the worst hemorrhaging of legitimate American secrets in the history of the American Republic. Okay? Period. Now, we can have another discussion about whether there are some byproducts that are good or bad or whatever, but in terms of hemorrhaging of secrets, nothing like this. More than Robert Hanssen, he's the FBI agent who worked for the Russians. More than Aldrich Ames, he's the CIA officer who worked for the Russians. And in both of those cases, people got dead. I mean, American sources were killed inside the Soviet Union, in the case of Ames, inside Russia, in the case of Hanssen. I understand the severity of that. But those were leaks. It's interesting, our language kind of betrays us. Leaks, drip, 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 water. Okay? And you measure leaks by, was that a glass? Was that a bucket? Was that a barrel? And you can argue about Ames and Hanssen and other traders that we've had. Snowden's different. Snowden's not dripping water. Well, he is. But in addition to that, he's reviewing the plumbing. He is actually articulating how it is the American and British services go about their business. And in that case, the harm is actually quite substantial. I'm out of government. I don't see anything secret, or rarely see anything secret. I get called in occasionally for discussions, very rarely about this. But I look at the current Director of National Intelligence, look at your head of MI5, look at your head of GCHQ, Ian Lobin, look at our CIA director, our NSA director, look at the chairs of our two congressional oversight committees, and all of them make it quite clear that this has been a legitimate intelligence targets are changing their practices when it comes to how they communicate. There's other damage too. There's damage inside the United States to the good name of the people who do this kind of work. The NSA director, right before our Thanksgiving, sent a letter home to every member of the workforce's family, in essence saying, your husband, your wife, your mom, your dad, brother, or sister, whatever, they are not criminals. They are loyal Americans serving legitimate foreign intelligence purposes. Now, I know we're going to discuss where those lines are and what constitutes legitimacy and not legitimacy, but look, as members of Western democracies, you've got to try to digest the reality, what it means when the head of America's largest intelligence service, about 35,000 people, feels compelled to send that kind of letter home. So there's a lot going on here in terms of damage with the leaks. I mentioned trying to move the story closer to the center line, closer to the truth as I know it. Let me start with Mr. Snowden. Why did Mr. Snowden, of the things he's listed, made public, or frankly, that he's given to correspondents who have then made public beyond his control, our Director of National Intelligence back home estimates about 10% of them involved questions of privacy of, in this case, of American citizens. The other 90% was about foreign intelligence. Why would Mr. Snowden, when he was in Hong Kong, looking for an opportunity to leave Hong Kong, right before our president met with President Xi Jinping of China, where our president was going to bring up the fact of really unrestricted submarine warfare in the terms of Chinese economic espionage against the United States, why would Mr. Snowden then leak allegations that the United States was conducting cyber espionage against the People's Republic? I mean, where's the civil liberties quotient in that? Snowden, in that first tape he made in Hong Kong, said in a rather dramatic voice, "I, sitting at my computer, if I had the email address, could read the emails of anyone, including the president." Remember that? Including the president of the United States. If he did that, by the way, that would violate the laws of the United States. Beyond that, it would violate the laws of physics. Okay? He did not have the wherewithal to do those kinds of things. So, as I promised, let me just jump through a couple of stories, okay? And try to suggest to you that you need to be a critical reader. And look, I understand, I already told you, this is a legitimate and necessary conversation. But I also suggest it has to be fact-based. So when you read the story, be a bit of a critical reader. That may not be accurate, may not have intended to be inaccurate, but it may not be totally accurate. Let's start with the first one that kind of broke loose. It's called the 215 program. That's the Metadata Program. It's Section 215 of our Patriot Act. That's why it's called 215. And you probably realize, NSA every day gets a dump on a large fraction of all of the phone calls in the United States. Not the content, just fact to call. I'm not sure how the British system works, but what used to be on our phone bills, you use the phone at this time to call that person for that long. And we get that, right? The first stories out of the gate were NSA's got all your phone calls, which is not quite true. Okay. The worst it could be is NSA's got all your phone bills. Okay. What wasn't told was then what happens to it. And without knowing what happens to it, it's very hard to judge. No, that eventually came out, all right? But it wasn't in the first tranche of the stories, and you kind of had to be an intel wonk like me to read the fine print over a matter of weeks before you learn the whole story. What happens to that data? It gets queried. It doesn't get mined. We don't launch an algorithm against it to say, we've got some suspicious patterns of activity here. It gets queried when NSA has what's called a seed number. So imagine some friends of ours roll up a safe house in Yemen. And from that safe house, we acquire a cell phone we've never seen before. Okay? And we know through the pocket litter, the stuff in the pockets of the individuals that were arrested, this is probably a pretty bad man. We then get to take that cell phone number we just rolled up in Yemen. I'm being a little cartoonish here, but bear with me. We get to walk up to the transom where we got those gajillion phone bills and simply say, this number here, did it ever show up in there? And from time to time, some phone number metaphorically will raise its hand and say, well, yeah, I talk to that number every Thursday. And then, according to the statute under which this is conducted, NSA gets to say, and who do you talk to? At which point, this is done. This is over. That is all that happens in this program. Now, I got a lot of my countrymen think that's a pretty bad story, what I just told you. Okay? They don't like the fact the government's got all these phone records, right? But let's argue about the reality. They query them rarely and only with a seed number, that's the term we use for that, name any number, about which we have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that that number is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. What I just told you, going up there and yelling into the box, and then last full year for which we have records is 2012. The 22 people at NSA authorized to ask that question, 2 supervisors, 20 analysts, those 22 people asked a question like that 288 times in the course of a year. And the answer to that question implicated 6,000 American numbers. Now, there probably a non-trivial portion of you who views that to be pretty bad. Fine. But let's argue about that, not about what it's not. The second story that came out was something called 702. 702 is a paragraph in the FISA Amendment Act, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It's what we use to legitimate collection inside the United States. By the way, we have more, Ian Loban's going to kill me. We have more rules and regulations than Ian operates under GCHQ, okay? It's just, you're as democratic as we are. Just things ended up in different places as to how you conduct oversight. 702 came out with a blaring headline, NSA is into the servers of Google and Microsoft and Facebook and Yahoo. Okay? That was a story. I mean, talk about a nuclear detonation, all right? Because that implicates just about everybody I talk to in the United States, and probably most of you too. The story was written by Bart Gellman of the Washington Post, and he was running up against a deadline because the Guardian over here was going to run at the same time. And the Post wanted to be first. And they will admit privately that they probably didn't do as much fact-checking as they should have. So the story rolls out. NSA is in the servers of Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebook, and so on. The fact is, and again, I freely admit, you may object to what I'm going to tell you now, but the fact is, under a court order, NSA can go to Eric Schmidt of Google. Want to be Eric for today here, Nicholas? Go to Eric Schmidt of Google and say, Eric, I want his email account. Okay? I want 2 from, waiting to be sent, all the attachments, give me his stuff. And I have a legitimate foreign intelligence purpose. I mean, I've already identified, you get the point. I already identified what account I want. And based on a generalized warrant, poor Eric here has to say yes, which he is not enthused about, as you can imagine. But he then gives us that information. Now, you may feel that's objectionable. Got it. But it is not NSA free-ranging inside Google, Yahoo, Microsoft's servers. It's a much more limited effort. Okay, 15 August, Washington Post. Above the fold, bold headlines. I got to read it to you. NSA breaking privacy rules thousands of times a year. You realize the Snowden stuff starts rolling out, what, June? So we got 2 months of this stuff cranking out, and NSA, like GCHQ, saying, we just follow the law, we protect American privacy, and now the headline is, NSA violates its own privacy rules thousands of times a year. Okay? Let me parse out that story for you. Okay? It was 3,600 times is the actual number. Okay? And the story was based on a document that Snowden had acquired. It was then given to different newsmen. And the story was based upon this document, which was an internal NSA document that was checking on NSA itself in order to the best of the agency's ability, make sure it was obeying all the privacy rules. In other words, it was a self-check. Okay? And they wrote it up in terms of self-criticism and said, hey, you're coloring outside the line here, you're coloring outside the line there. Okay? So in a sense, I mean, it's what you would expect in terms of due diligence of an agency. Now you might be worried, 3,600, Hayden, that sounds like a pretty big number. So let's parse the 3,600. 2/3 of the 3,600 were what the agency calls roamers. Okay? We have great legal authorities outside the United States. NSA has very limited legal authorities inside the United States. Okay? The roamers comprise foreign cell phones that were legitimate targets of American intelligence collection being targeted overseas. These cell phones, one way or another, could be a diplomat, could be a traveler, could be a terrorist coming into the country. These cell phones end up in the United States. I've got an iPhone upstairs in the library. I actually was on a conference call back to the States. And when that cell phone comes into the United States, for billing purposes, it almost always goes back to Vodafone or back to whatever service is providing it its service. It goes back to the country of origin so the phone company can get their money, okay? And then comes back into the United States, and it comes flying into the United States like, for all the world, a foreign-based call. And NSA intercepts it because it's coming this way. Its origins are over there. Fair game. Until NSA, listening to the content of the call, hears somebody saying, the fleet is in, the weather's great, I'm going to the zoo, I love San Diego. At which point NSA discovers, oh, that legitimate number we were legitimately collecting is now in the United States. And I can't legitimately continue to collect against it. And now that I've discovered that it's in the United States, I have to stop collection. 2/3 of the thousands of violations of privacy were roamers. Let me give you another category of violation of privacy. It was in the article. NSA 162 times in a quarter, okay? The whole thing was for a year, but in one of the quarters, 160 times put overly broad parameters on search inquiries. You all do search inquiries, right? You're on the web and you're looking for data, papers due. You frame the inquiry and you put it in and it comes out with information that you can use. Well, NSA and GCHQ, by the way, every time I say NSA, think GCHQ, all right? We operate very similarly. NSA put overly broad search terms that made the query too voracious inside the database and thereby pulled out information, legitimately collected information, but information that should have been better protected once collected. Over voracious search terms and pulled it out 162 times in a 3-month period. Remember, self-reported, self-identified, we're checking ourselves, okay? That's the numerator, 162. What's the denominator? 63 million. Okay. So let me give you an alternative headline to Bart Gelman's story, which was NSA breaking privacy rules thousands of times a year. I think a good alternative headline would be NSA, damn near perfect. There was a story in The Guardian by Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. Got to read the headline. NSA shares intel, including American data, with Israel. Talk about a disturbance in the force back home, okay? And that's a pretty powerful headline. Now look, I don't know the secrecy of the, this is all happening after I left government, okay? But with my background, which I understand a lot of you do not share, but I'm trying to suggest to you, be a critical reader when you hear these stories. Because what this story did was to take clearly a document that Snowden had leaked, okay, pulled it forward, and read that, according to the document, again, I can either confirm or deny, I'm out of government, NSA was bending a collection pipe and sending it to the Israelis who may have had better cultural, linguistic, whatever, abilities to work it. And within it, NSA reminded the Israelis, according to the paper, okay, reminded the Israelis that you need to pay attention to U.S. privacy in here. You cannot be reporting on U.S. persons. Okay? But the headline, and frankly most of the story, seemed to suggest, remember that 215 program, all of the American phone bills? Seemed to suggest 702 program, emails sitting on servers in Redmond, Washington, that was the kind of stuff being dropped on the Israelis, and that the Americans were being very insensitive with American privacy. In reality, if you have some background and you read the document, the Americans are being hyper cautious about American privacy, taking a collection system in which the presence of American data is probably, somewhere between 0 and 0.0001, and reminding the Israelis, even though there's a low probability, don't. You've got to respect American privacy. I was on Fox News. You know Fox News? Centerline, American broadcast service. 2 days before Christmas. And I frankly forget what the expose that was, but it was breathless. Okay, I think it had something to do with NSA and GCHQ and fiber optic cables. And, I mean, any of you studied the physics of this, fiber optic cables carry a whole bunch of stuff, and so if you have access to a fiber optic cable, you got data. So John Roberts was the newsman. We're the lead story. So I'm there, and he says, "General, you got fiber optics, and they're doing this, and they're breaking codes, and they're decrypting, and dun, 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 dun." And it was all kind of, John's a good guy, but it was all kind of coming out as an indictment. Okay? He says, "So what are we to think about this, General?" Remember, 2 days before Christmas. I said, "John, you should think you're getting something for your $55 billion a year you spend on these guys." In other words, I'm going to be very candid. What is it you think GCHQ was doing? What did you think NSA was doing if they weren't intercepting communications? Now, let's get to the nub of this, because I've been a little critical of Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald and Bart Gellman and maybe even Mr. Snowden, and saying, you're not getting a true picture here. But let's put that aside. Let's assume that well, you could assume they're all true. Or you could assume that you know enough to figure out what's the truth in it. All right? Okay. So let's not let me just get away here with claiming, oh, it's all a bunch of lies, don't pay any attention to that, move along, folks, there's nothing to see here. All right? Let's just give it merit. Let's just say, okay, whoa, those are interesting questions. I'm not so sure I like that stuff. Okay? Let's assume that. If you do, there are a couple other additional steps you have to take if we're going to have that fact-based discussion. I was with a group last night over at Pembroke, and I used this kind of crude metaphor. I said, all of us, you more than me because of my previous life, but all of us in one way or another, we kind of just barged into a movie theater during the third reel. Okay? We're, with these things kind of pumping out about every 7 to 10 days, we're seeing the last scenes, and we're making the judgment that the butler did it, when we haven't had the benefit of reels 2 and reel 1 as to what got us to this denouement. Okay? So now I'm done criticizing newspaper reporters. I want to talk to you about the work we did at NSA and by extension at GCHQ. I want to talk to you about the challenges we had in the late 1990s, pre-9/11, all right, pre-9/11, and that have moved forward. I want to talk to you about why it is NSA and GCHQ are doing some of the things they're doing. And again, at the end of this, you may say, interesting, Hayden, didn't know that before. I still don't want them doing it. Got it. But let's base it on a fuller understanding. So let's begin with dangers in the world. Let's begin with threats. I was on the National Security Council staff of President Bush 41. The National Security Advisor for Bush 41 was Brent Scowcroft, probably a familiar name to many of you. He was actually National Security Advisor twice. He was Bush 41 but it was also Gerald Ford, National Security Advisor. Clearly one of America's great strategic thinkers. Brent wrote an article about 18 months ago for the Atlantic, not the Atlantic magazine in New York, but an Atlantic Society in Washington, D.C., a think tank. And Brent pointed out the following things. Bear with me here. It's a little bit long, but it gets to an interesting place. Brent said that, you know, when I was doing my thing, if this was the board here, okay, that's the chessboard, all the pieces on that board were nation states. And the way I moved pieces around was through what we now call hard power. Okay, let me define quickly hard power: masses of men and metal. Okay, at the right place and at the right time. And you don't even, you really don't even have to use it. If we don't like someone, it's the threat of masses of men. And if we do like you, it's the promise of masses of men and metal. But Brent's point was, doing my thing, at the height of the industrial era, Ford, and the back end of the industrial era, Bush 41, pieces on the board were nation states, and I moved them around by saying, where are the carriers, where are the Marines? And what Brent is now saying in the article, neither of those two sentences, nation states are all the pieces I care about, and I move them through hard power, neither of them are as true as they were when he was National Security Advisor. He points out that, remember I mentioned he was doing this at the height and back end of the industrial era. He points out that in the industrial era, most things trended to strengthen the nation state. I think of my own nation. The Republican political party in the United States is remembered most of all at its origins because it was the anti-slavery party. But it actually had two pillars at its foundation. One was anti-slavery. The other one was the government building the national infrastructure. And it was the Republicans who created legal structures for the railroads to be built and so on. I think most of us will vote against communism as a theory of government, and particularly as a theory of history, but as a methodology to rapidly industrialize a backward state, not bad. In other words, in the industrial era, you needed strong states in order to be successful. This is an American example. It may apply here. I'm old enough to remember when making a phone call was such a difficult undertaking that we trusted it only to a government or a government-controlled monopoly. And now, certainly back home, the last thing we want is the government controlling whether or not our phone calls get through. After that healthcare website thing, we don't want anyone around our communications. In other words, what Brent is trying to point out, that whereas the industrial era seemed to strengthen states, the post-industrial information era pushes power down to the level of individuals. You and I are empowered to do things we never were able to do when I was your age, all right? Again, I'm old enough to remember that I had to get in a car, drive to a building, and talk to a human being to get my money. None of you do that now. Okay. It's power down for good. I like that part. I don't have to wait until the bank's open to get money. Power down for bad. Again, I'm old enough to remember that I didn't lose any sleep over a religious fanatic living in the Hindu Kush. I've lost a lot of sleep over those guys in the past 12 years. What Brent was trying to point out is that threats we used to only associate with nation states in terms of their severity are now being pushed down to sub-state actors, and in some cases, down even to individuals, or in my country's experience, 19 individuals on September 11th. And that is very difficult for Britain's and America's security services. Now I'll talk as an American here because I know it far better. The American security services were hardwired in 1947, right after World War II, because of the National Security Act of that era, which created CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and America's Air Force. We are hardwired to work against nation states. And now we and you are trying to take that structure designed to deal with nation states and bend it over here like that to deal with non-state actors. And it's clumsy, and it's blunt, and it's controversial. For example, my country believes it's at war with Al-Qaeda. Now, yours isn't quite in that place, and the continental Europeans are way far away from that place. But my country believes it's at war with Al-Qaeda. Okay, war with Al-Qaeda. Kill the enemy. That's what we did. We did it in World War II together. Okay? We did it in Iraq together. We did it in Afghanistan together. War with Al-Qaeda. Kill the enemy. Targeted killings against individuals from unmanned aerial vehicles outside of internationally agreed theaters of conflict. Ooh, that's controversial. In a conflict with the enemy, you get to capture the enemy and hold them for the duration of the conflict. We did it by the hundreds of thousands in World War II. Guantanamo. In a war with the enemy, you get to intercept their communications. Janine and I spent Saturday at Bletchley, for God's sake. Okay? We know about this stuff. We know about Enigma. On the American side, we know about Purple and the Battle of Midway. Intercept the enemy's communications. Practically everything Edward Snowden has revealed over the past 8 months. What's going on is that your security services are trying to adjust to a completely different circumstance of danger. Let me go on further. I became director of NSA in 1999. So Soviet Union's long gone. But NSA and GCHQ has a history about the Soviet Union. Okay? One of the things we really fretted about back in the day, in the Cold War, was Soviet missile forces. And so we spent a very large sum of money to be able to detect broadcasts coming out of Strategic Rocket Forces headquarters in Moscow, going out to the Soviet ICBM fields beyond the Ural Mountains in Soviet Asia, or further south in Soviet Central Asia. And like I said, that was a big job. And we were on that network, kind of a dedicated network, but we were on that network, you know, listening for words of interest, like launch. Okay. If you want GCHQ, or for the Americans in the room, NSA, to give you that kind of warning against today's threats, they're going to have to be reading somebody's Gmail or somebody's Hotmail. Because today's threats don't exist on isolated microwave networks coming out of Moscow and hopping up over the Ural Mountains. By the way, isn't a civil libertarian in the universe who would raise his little finger that much over intercepting that signal. But the equivalent of that signal today are terrorists, our proliferator, our narco-traffickers, or name your flavor of danger, communicating on a global integrated communications grid in which there is no way around this, in which your communications are coexisting with theirs. Period. That's just the way it is. And do you see the challenge? A third challenge we had was volume. And again, I'm looking around, a lot of young folks in the room, but some, you know, between me and there. Think of your own communications patterns. All right? I mean, again, not so long ago, back home, we wouldn't make a long-distance phone call until Sunday night at 6 o'clock because that's when the rates went down, and it was cheaper. And you can actually detect American communications. I was at the AT&T Ops Center up in Basking Ridge, and they were showing the history of communications. On a Sunday, it is bottom dragging. There is nothing going on until 6 p.m. Eastern time, burr, 6 p.m. Central time, burr. I mean, and now, I just got finished with a 90-minute conference call to Northern Virginia on my cell phone. Thought nothing of it. I mean, what I'm trying to describe for you is you and I are putting a whole hell of a lot more electrons and photons out there in terms of communication. And so in 1999, NSA was becoming overwhelmed by volume. So was GCHQ. Right? I mean, there's just so much there. Oh man! And for maybe half a decade, we treated volume as our enemy. How do I defeat volume? How do I make volume go away? I mean, I used the example last night of kind of standing there, like this, pushing back against the tsunami and saying, I got to stop this thing, because I can't deal with all that. And then about 1999, 2000, we decided, turn around and start swimming with that tsunami. In other words, don't fight the volume. You cannot defeat it. Make volume your friend. Turn volume into usable information. Otherwise, frankly, GCHQ, NSA, they don't work anymore. Okay? Let me tell you the current popular word for volume: bulk data collection. And I know many folks here, well, I suppose many folks here, I know a lot of folks back home are just, I don't like that bulk data collection thing. Okay? But I'm trying to tell you what happened in real one. Okay? What happened in real one is we realized that the threats were not coming from nation states. In real one, we realized that you could not defeat volume. You had to go with volume. In real one, we knew that the communications you want us to cover are commingled unavoidably with your communications. We had an additional one, both in the United States and in Great Britain. Ours is 9/11, yours is 7/7, or pick one or another event that you had. Bad people were in here. And so how do you deal with the reality that geography doesn't seem to quite matter the way it used to? After 9/11, we had something called the JIC, J-I-C, Joint Inquiry Commission, very unusual body at NSA in the United States. It was our House and Senate intelligence committees conducting a combined inquiry as to how'd you guys let this happen? And that was kind of the tone. There's a picture on the cover of Time magazine with George Tenet, director of CIA at the time, Bob Mueller, director of FBI, and me, like this. Okay? Because this is all going to be sworn testimony. One of the findings of the JIC was NSA, that would be me, because I've been director 2 years by then, NSA was far too cautious in attempting to intercept terrorist-related communications, one end of which was in the United States. And so we set out to how do you detect the one end in the United States terrorist-related communication without creating a dragnet over Dearborn, Michigan, or Fremont, California, or other large Islamic populations, and then doing keyword searches out of all of their communications. And that 215 program, the Metadata Program, did anybody talk to that phone number in Yemen? That's what that was designed to do. Keith Alexander is going to leave NSA next month. Keith is actually my successor. Okay? If Keith and I were here, all right, we'd be the only two directors of the National Security Agency in the last 15 years. Okay? Because I had 6 and change, and he had 8 and change. We had up to almost 15. Keith would tell you right now, hey, remember that metadata collection, 215 gajillion records? Keith would tell you, hey, if you got a better way, let me know. But right now, that is the softest touch I can make on American privacy and still have reasonable confidence I can detect that phone call you told me I was too scared to detect before 9/11. Terrorist-related, one inside the United States. Okay? So that's kind of all 3 reels of the movie. Now you may still come out here in reel 3 and say, yeah, cool, Hayden, but I'm willing to take my chances. I'm willing to embrace greater risk. I don't want my agencies doing that. Back home, all right? By the way, back home, this is happening in a perfect storm. All right? You've got the NSA story, and I don't know how much you follow the American press, but you got the IRS story, which is the IRS kind of going after right-wing groups. You got the Benghazi story and what may or may not have happened at Benghazi. By the way, on the evening news, all of these are not called stories. They're the IRS scandal, the Benghazi scandal, the NSA scandal. All right, and we do have a swirl back home of fear of both government and executive overreach that is making it harder for us, certainly, to have the conversation, the kind of conversation that I'm trying to sponsor between us here today. So you got, oh yeah, one more thing. Back home, you follow our politics? If I say Tea Party, you all kind of go, uh-huh, yeah, okay, yeah. And usually when this kind of debate happens in the American democracy, it's the American left that says, I don't want you doing that. Okay? And the American right saying, no, we really have to be secure here. First duty of a state is to defend its citizens. Now you've got the extremes of the American left and the American right. You know, it's not a spectrum anymore, it's a horseshoe. And the American left and the American right are rather strongly allied to this. So this all becomes pretty big news. About, like I said, every week or 10 days, you got another thing. I can imagine being Ian Lobin down at Cheltenham or Keith Alexander up at Fort Meade at NSA. You know, get up in the morning, stretch, maybe put the coffee pot on, and walk out and grab your local newspaper and stand by for the daily indictment coming from one or another leaked document. Okay? So it created quite a stir in the United States. President Obama appointed a commission, 5 people, former deputy director of CIA, a former Mike Morrell, who apparently was here a while back, Richard Clark, who was on the National Security Council staff for several presidents, and then 3 academics. Okay, some steeped in law, some steeped in privacy thought. I do not mean to be overly critical of anyone, but my professional view of the report they gave to the president with 46 recommendations was, it appeared to me to be intelligence strategy written in the faculty lounge. Okay? Now, though many people here actually go to the faculty lounge, I beg forgiveness already, all right? But it seemed to be divorced from the necessities of security, and it seems to have been written in a fairly idealistic world. So President Obama now, who, by the way, ran as being not George Bush, remember? Okay. President Obama takes this report and frankly, doesn't do much with it. President Obama gave a speech about 2.5 weeks ago now, in which he laid out, okay, here's what we're going to do, team. Got these issues, serious debate, here's the plan. First third of the speech was the most ringing endorsement of American intelligence and the necessity for American intelligence in a dangerous world that President Obama has given in his 5+ years in office. For people like me, it was, that's wonderful. Where has this been? Okay. I actually said on our national TV, you know, if he'd have been given that first third of the speech for the last 7 months, he wouldn't have had to give the last 2/3 of the speech. Let me go to the last 2/3. The middle third was about domestic stuff. And in essence, he's saying, I love bulk data. I love metadata. We're going to keep it. All right. Okay, maybe I'll let somebody else hold it. Okay, maybe I'll ask a judge whether or not I get to ask that phone number about that Yemen phone, and okay, but we're keeping it. Which is, you know, one of the most dramatic things of all. With regard to foreign collection, we haven't talked much about foreigners. I mean, those who are foreigners to an American. We got this kerfluffle with the Chancellor of Germany. Did you read about that? The president said that he has directed, by his authority, that we will stop collection against the personal communications of dozens of world leaders. He did use the word dozens. It was plural. If you're asking me for an opinion, it's 2 dozen, okay, that he stopped. But if you read the speech, and particularly if you read the white paper that that the White House chucked out the door simultaneously with the speech. It was, we will stop collection against dozens of foreign leaders unless, of course, we want to. And that actually is, I am not being overly irreverent here, all right? It simply said, unless, of course, there's a compelling national security reason, which is the only reason you do this stuff in the first place. Okay? He then said, we will treat data collected on non-U.S. persons like data collected on U.S. persons in terms of how we retain it, that's essentially how long, and how we report it. Do we put your name in there or not? Okay? As a practical matter, that's what NSA does anyway. I mean, even for a U.S. person, if your data, and we do pick up data about U.S. persons in legitimate foreign intelligence collection, all right? You keep it while it's useful, and you report it if it's useful. As a practical matter, that's what we do for everything and for everybody. The president just made policy what was practice. Okay? And no real change. So I'm on national TV, and Friday was a speech, Sunday I'm on one of those morning talk shows back home, and I get asked, you know, General, it just seems like President Obama has validated President Bush's surveillance programs. And my answer was, he has. And I obviously am comfortable with that. Many of you probably are not. But I'm comfortable with it because I lived through all three reels. I know why we are where we are. But I also recognize that you don't get to do this over the long term out of the will of the sovereign. You don't get to do this over the long term simply because the president says to do it. You get to do one-offs simply because the president does it. But in democratic systems, the prime minister's will and the president's will erode over time, and you cannot sustain these things unless there is broad political support or at least broad political acceptance. So the president has staked out his program pretty much steady as you go. And now we are going to have a very interesting national discussion back home. Remember my horseshoe describing the American political process? With the extreme left and the extreme right, and in many cases, the not so extreme left and not so extreme right, aligning in a very unusual way to keep these questions in front of the American Congress. So we'll see what Congress says. But I do think I've given you a fair rendering of what President Obama has said, which is all a head full.